across the world is well over 10 million. And because they've constructed a system of over 3,000 trade and investment agreements, all of which entrench property rights around the world, the global reach of patents today is far greater than it was in 1995. So approximately, and I give figures, they're very approximate, and you'll not be surprised it's difficult to get the data, but patents give monopoly incomes that are equivalent to about 20% of global income, right? In addition to patents, there's copyright. Copyright has been vastly strengthened over the last 25 years as a result of TRIPS and other these agreements. And copyright, of course, gives a monopoly income for the whole of the person's life or the corporation's existence plus 70 years. So if you have a copyright, you get a monopoly income flow for the whole of your life plus 70 years. I don't know what the flip you're going to do with the money after you leave us, but you get the idea. If this is a free market, again, I'm a duck. The same with industrial designs and brands. Most of the big corporations earn most of their income from these different forms of property rights, not from producing whatever they produce. It's a lie that we have a free market at all. But in addition, and I go into that stuff at length in the book, I won't bore you anymore on that subject, but in addition to the intellectual property rights, which is backed by financial capital, which is making much of the rental income, we have a systematic buildup of regressive subsidies. Every single state provides billions of subsidies to the affluent, to corporations, to the holder of property rights, often dressed up, we must encourage them to come to our country and not to their country. Bullshit is the English word that comes to mind. But subsidies are built up over this period, and guess what? They cause what they call budget deficits. And budget deficits lead to bubbles, what we call bubbles in economics, and to financial crises. And then governments turn around and they say, we have a deficit, so we must cut benefits and lower living standards of our population because we must give those subsidies to capital. This is complete fabrication of logic. Because you've been making tax cuts to favor capital, to bring them to your country. You've been favoring subsidies. You've been supporting this intellectual property rights, etc. And then we have a peculiar phenomenon that is the outcome of all of this, which is that because wages and living standards have been falling, governments have been trying to fill the gap by things like tax credits and allowing easy access to debt. So millions of us are in chronic debt. Debt is a rent-extracting mechanism. It's extracting income that goes to the Goldman Sachses and the Apples and the various big corporations as an extra income. To call this the result of free markets is again a lie. And then we have something which is very close to my heart, and I'm sure it is to many of yours. We have the systematic plunder of the commons. The commons, not just land, but all our common facilities and common amenities, which have been built up by generations of Swedes, of British, of whatever. They're part of our heritage, they're part of our income, and yet governments have been privatizing them, commercializing them, and handing them over to those rent-seeking corporations. It's not very profound, but it's what's happening. And then we have the last bit of the puzzle, a technological revolution which is taking place, which is entrenching not only the rentiers in Silicon Valley, but is also producing platform capitalism, whereby we have a new phenomenon coming up the road, crowd labor, whereby more and more of our labor transactions will be done online. So the old idea of an employer-employee relation will gradually disappear. And these apps and platform capitalism in general is a system of labor brokers, rentiers, extracting. Every time you use a Uber or Airbnb or whatever it might be, the broker is making 20% or 25% of the transaction. It's rental income. And of course, the outcome, as we all know or should know and be reminding our constituents and people we want to attract to our cause, is the breakdown of the income distribution system of the 20th century. The 20th century had a law. It was my own professor at Cambridge actually made the law in his articles called Kaldor's Law, which was that over time, the share of income going to capital and the share going to labor would be roughly constant. It would fluctuate in the short term, but over time it would stay roughly the same. Since this process has been unleashed on us, Kaldor's law is broken down. He's dead now, but he would be rolling in his grave. Because everywhere across the world, the share going to capital has been going up and the share going to labor has been going down. But if you look, as I've tried to do in this book, more carefully, you will see that within the share going to capital, the share going to rental income has been going up big time. So big corporations that have the ability to control rental incomes have been growing relative to everybody else. And within the share, the diminishing share going to labor, the groups that are able to get rental income have been gaining, and the group I'm about to talk about has been losing. So the precariat has been losing, put this on the side for a thought, in two respects. And Kaldor's law is not only broken down, but we have a very strange phenomenon. When I was a student of economics, I don't know how many of you are economists, there were certain obvious things. You know, you learned first term. The first one was that when productivity went up, wages went up. Yeah, if you didn't know that, you should take up something else. You failed. First term exam. In this period, in country after country, when productivity goes up, wages go down, on average. It's never happened before. It's the opening of the jaws of snake. The second jaw of snake is, again, first term economics. When employment went up, average wages went up. Obvious. Except now it doesn't work like that. In many, many countries, when employment goes up, average wages go down. Because the new jobs coming in are paying lower wages, and the old jobs that were paying high wages have been lost. Didn't used to happen like that. The same with profits. Used to be when profits went up, wages went up. In country after country, that no longer holds. The jaws of the snake are growing. Now, I now get to the main point of my talk. I apologize for taking much time on the previous bits, but as you can probably guess, they're rather important for understanding what's happening to the precariat. Now, we're experiencing the growth of a global class structure. I've had many arguments with old-style Marxists. Fortunately, I can match them, I hope, because I know my Marx, because I'm Marxist. We must move away from 19th century concepts and terminology and think in terms of the 21st century. The new emerging class structure has a plutocracy at the top, global citizens who owe no allegiance to any nation state. They're full-time rentiers. We know their names, we wish we didn't. Then there's an elite that are serving their interests, multi-millionaires making vast fortunes, mainly from forms of rent. Underneath them is a salariat, people who still have long-term employment security, the prospect of pensions, paid holidays, paid maternity leave, paid paternity leave, you name it. That's a shrinking number. And many write to me and they're worried about their sons and daughters because they're not becoming part of the salariat. Alongside them is a group of proficients making vast money but insecure in many respects. Frenetic lifestyles, they think they're very clever, but then they suddenly have a problem. Don't feel too sorry for them because they make a lot of money. Below them is the old proletariat. And left politics must not try to recreate the past. Progressive politics built around the proletariat in the 20th century was a force for good. I want to make that very clear. But it's no longer the essence of a progressive politics today. Because all progressive politics, to have success, must be harnessed to the needs and aspirations of the emerging mass class. And that mass class comes below the proletariat in terms of income and many other respects. And you can define the precariat by three dimensions, using Marxian conceptualization. First of all, the precariat has distinctive relations of production. What this means, in essence, is they're being habituated to accept and internalize a life of unstable labor and unstable living. Casualization, short-term contracts, you name it, you know it. But this is actually the least important aspect of the precariat. It's the obvious one, it's the one that newspaper commentators write about, but it's not the most important, as far as I'm concerned, by any means. In addition, if you're in the precariat anywhere in the world, you have no occupational narrative to give to your life, a sense of becoming something. You have no corporate narrative either. The term I use when I'm talking with philosophers is you have no sense of ontological security, a sense of becoming something. And that's crucial for the whole Enlightenment project throughout history. In addition, if you're in the precariat, you have to do a lot of work for labor that doesn't get counted as labor, doesn't get remunerated, it doesn't get recognized in our official statistics. But if you're in the precariat, as thousands of people who write to me stress, you have to do a vast amount of work. And if you don't, you pay a heavy price. Retraining, waiting around, form filling, applying for jobs, doing this, doing that, waiting. You also have to do a lot of work for the state, for which you don't get recognized or remunerated. But if you don't do it, heavy price. And then, again, this is the first emerging class in history whose modal level of education is above the level of labor they can expect to obtain. That causes a sense of existential insecurity or status frustration, call it what you like. And you have a loss of control over time. You don't know what's the best use of your time. Should I do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little, flip me, I don't know, should I? and you suffer from what I call the precariatized mind, a loss of control of your time, stress. The second dimension is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. That means, first of all, that people in the precariat have to rely almost entirely, and increasingly so, all over the world, on money wages rather than non-wage forms of remuneration. And these money wages are not only falling gradually in real terms, but are becoming more volatile and uncertain. So they're losing non-wage benefits in various ways, and they're losing access to rights-based state benefits. In country after country, more and more of the precariat have to rely on means-tested, behavior-tested state benefits. And that, of course, plunges them into horrendous poverty traps. Poverty traps meaning that going from lousy benefits into the sort of lousy, low-paid jobs that they can obtain means they pay a marginal tax rate of over 80%. I was in Denmark recently, and it's been calculated it's 86% in Denmark. In Germany, it's probably 87 or 88%. In Britain, the British minister in charge claims, but I think he's wrong, that the marginal tax rate is 80%. Wow! If the salariat had to pay a marginal tax rate of 80%, they'd be doing what the employers did in Stockholm many years ago when I was working in this country. They would be demonstrating it en masse, right? But the precariat is expected to put up with that. And if they don't, they're told they're ungrateful, they're slacking, they're idle, etc., etc. All the common epithets of insult flow, and they're penalized. Not only are people having to rely on declining real wages and loss of benefits, but they're living all the time on the edge of unsustainable debt. One mistake, one illness, one wrong decision, and they could become the new scourge of our age, homeless. That's the reality for the precariat. The third dimension is the dimension that I regard as the most important, because the precariat has distinctive relations to the state. It's the first class in history which is systematically losing le droit acquis, the accumulated rights of citizenship. They're losing cultural rights. They can't belong to a community that gives them identity and believing in progress. They're losing civil rights. They can't get access to due process, the law, equality before the law. They're losing social rights because they don't have rights for benefits. They're losing economic rights because they cannot practice what they are actually qualified to do. And then they are losing political rights because they don't see in the political party spectrum in their countries a party that represents the precariat. That's a big whammy. And so in the end, the most defining feature of being in the precariat, and every time I say this, I'm pleased to say that somebody writes to me and says, that's true, which is that if you're in the precariat, you are a supplicant, essentially a beggar. You have to ask for favors, be it from a parent or a bureaucrat or an employer or from your friends or from a short-term lender, or all of the above. And being a supplicant, of course, is degrading. And this leads to the aspect which is very important for us politically. The precariat has a distinctive consciousness. In my books, I've emphasized the 4 A's: sense of alienation, sense of anomie, despair, a sense of anxiety, and a sense of anger. But there's something more than just having that sense of anger, which is a sense of relative deprivation. And here, so far, the precariat has been a class in the making, not yet a class for itself, because it has been fragmented. Fragmented into the first group, what I call the atavists, people who don't have as much education as many of the others, who have a sense of feeling that they have lost the past. They have a feeling that they're not getting what their parents had or what their grandparents had as workers and as people. This group listens to the neo-fascist populists. Their current leader is a Donald Trump. The AfD in Germany played on that, your own party. I hate them, but I'm not going to mention their name. They represent them. The second group are what I call the nostalgics. These people have a sense of a relative deprivation with respect to a lost present. They don't have a home. They don't have an identity that can give them a sense of belonging now. This group won't vote neo-fascist populist. They tend not to vote at all. Or if they're migrants, are denied those votes and are disenfranchised. Every now and then, as you know in Sweden more than most countries, they have days of rage where looting or explosions take place because the repressions are too great. Right? And if I were in that part, I'd probably do just the same. I confess. The third part I call the progressives. And these are mainly the young, but not only the young, who go to university, go to college, and they were promised a future. And they come out with no future except debt and a sense of frustration. Now, this group won't vote neo-fascist populism either. They are looking for a new politics of paradise. They are looking for a new progressive politics. And that's what parties like yours and those of us on the left in other countries have to realize, because that is the growing part of the precariat. The way I put it is that probably the atavists have peaked. They got their Brexit, they got their Trump, they're doing damage elsewhere as well, but their numbers have probably reached a peak, I hope. Whereas the progressive part is growing and growing and growing. And this part is where we have to pitch our aspirations, our policies, and our vocabulary, our conceptualizing of what it means to be a progressive, an egalitarian in the 21st century. I think the precariat has been undergoing a remarkable transformation in the past 10 years or so, since the financial crisis. It's remarkable because it's global. I've just examined a PhD dissertation on the growth of the Chinese precariat by a Chinese woman student. Beautiful dissertation. She understands it so well. And I think the phase that was at the beginning, in the Occupy movement and so on, the Indignados and so on, was a matter of recognition, a matter of identity, a matter of what I call the mirror test. That you look in the mirror in the morning and you don't feel sorry for yourself. You look in the mirror and say, I'm part of the precariat. There are millions like me. Yeah, I'm part of it. And we're going to fight back. That sense of recognition has been coming very fast by historical standards. The next struggle, which is still going on, is a struggle for representation, a struggle for new institutions and mechanisms of solidarity for and by the precariat. And here, the left must understand that the primary antagonist, notice I say primary, not only, the primary antagonist for the precariat is not the capitalist boss, the employer. Probably you don't know who it is. It might be one and it changes and all of that. The primary antagonist is the state. Because it is the state which has built up these institutions. It's the state which is imposing the regulations which are so fundamentally unfair and unjust. It is the state which is telling the precariat they have to put up with it and be more competitive. And therefore, we must understand that the direction of the rhetoric and direction of our strategy must be towards the state. And the third struggle is a struggle for redistribution. What does that mean? If I talk to a precariat group in any place in the world, and I've been privileged to speak to hundreds in about 40 countries, if I talk about capturing the means of production or overthrowing the capitalist superstructure or whatever it might be, they'll all run for the bar. What they're talking about is just as important. They're talking about a redistribution and equality of access to the key assets of modern society. What are they? The first one, the first and fundamental asset is security, economic security. The inequality of economic security is much greater than the inequality of income or wealth, measured conventionally. Because if you're up in the salariat or an elite, you have total security. If you're down in the precariat with debts, with a small child, rent to pay, whatever it might be, you have no security at all. None. None. So we need a strategy that gives everybody basic security. The precariat understand that. That's why they're supporting basic income in big time. In addition, we need to understand that a key asset is time, quality time. The ability to have control of how I can allocate my time, be it to care, be it to labor, be it to leisure in the political sense, be it into any other sense of use of time. We need a new politics of time that is not the old social democratic shortening working hours sort of approach. That was appropriate for industrial capitalism, big progress. But today, if you merely shorten working time in the conventional sense, you will merely lead to more exploitation outside the paid hours or the paid week or whatever it might be. We need a new strategy, a new politics of time. Third, quality space. The precariat needs a rich and enriching commons. More than any other group in society, if you deprive the precariat of the commons in different ways, you lower their living standards. Whereas the salariat doesn't really care. The elite doesn't care if it's privatized. They don't use the commons much. And then we need a strategy for redistribution of real education. The elite still get their liberating education. They can still go to elite colleges and places, learn about art and culture, whatever they want to choose. The precariat are merely prepared to be job holders. We need a strategy to decommodify education. Now, all of this is in the second book, The Precariat Charter, which has been translated into Swedish. But I believe that in the last 2 years, we're seeing a new energy around this debate, because many people who wouldn't count themselves as part of the precariat are beginning to align themselves with issues of the precariat. I had the amusing experience of being invited to Silicon Valley and to San Francisco. This doesn't happen often to someone like me, to speak to a bunch of billionaires. Names, most of them people in the room, you know their names. I knew their names. I gave them a talk on the corruption of capitalism. And at the end of it, a man who was sitting there who has just been named by Forbes as the American entrepreneur of the decade, a man with many, many billions, he stood up and he said, "Guy, I think you're saying that the system is rigged." And I said, "Yeah, that's about it." And he said, "Guy, listening to you, I agree with you." And I've just been this year, again, I've had many showers to try and get the dirt off. I've been invited to speak at Davos in January. And in the end, they asked me to give 4 talks, not just one. I thought they'd throw me down the mountain. And last night, I've just been invited back for next year. So clearly I am saying something wrong, obviously. But I believe many of them, those corporate types, are getting scared. They're getting scared because they feel that a revolt is coming. They feel that they have no legitimacy. Their system has no legitimacy. And believe me or not, most of those people hate Donald Trump as much as we do. They hate the neo-fascist populists coming up. Of course, they don't embrace what we would embrace, but the fact is they're in a mood to make concessions. And what I want to end with is this. We on the left have no excuse for being timid. We must be bold, courageous in defining our politics of paradise. Thank you very much.
This works? Yep. Okay. Funkar? Works. Now
Yeah,
it works. Okay. Thank you very much. I think a lot of the things that you say strikes, of course, a chord with the audience here and the work in our party and on the left in general. So I will try to find some of the points where maybe we have some differences, or maybe there's a place for further discussion and deepening. You said towards the end of your talk that the sort of enemy of the precariat, as the precariat would understand it, would not be capital, it would be the state. And I understand what you're aiming at. But listening to you and also reading your book, sometimes one gets the impression that you put the precariat very much against what you call the salariat. So the problem would be that the people the precariat meet that would sort of make them worried or angry would be the groups that actually have a job that pays full-time wages and that gives them some kind of rights above their wages also. I think that maybe this has some deep-going strategical implications. Maybe it would be quite problematic to create or say that that is the most important, or one of the most important splits, rather than saying that we should find a common ground between what you call the solariat and what you call the precariat. That would maybe be underlined by the fact that in a country like Sweden, for instance, the solariat still is by far the biggest group. So there are many more people having full-time jobs and working conditions that are determined by collective bargaining, etc., than those who are not. Even though it's obvious that the latter group has been growing and has been a factor to reckon with, and the perspective of the left has, in many ways, been to try to propose legislation and other measures to not have more people getting into what you call the precariat, rather than saying that we should direct all policies towards the precariat. What is your take on that, on the strategical dimension of that counterposing?
Let me see if I can respond briefly to that. In the final chapter of the book, A Precariat Charter, in that book I've listed 29 policies which I think essentially capture a precariat progressive strategy. And the last chapter asks the question, rhetorically, where would there be potential for cross-class alliances politically? And I think that with the salariat, there are potentials that exist. There are certain areas which we can't expect, okay? When I worked in Sweden in the late 1980s, I was working with Rudolf Meidner, a good friend, a great man. And at that time, the split between the white-collar unions and the LO was there, but it was nothing like what it is today. The white-collar unions in this country and elsewhere, I made someone sick, I hope that she's all right. All right? Sorry. Maybe mentioning the split with the unions. But today, the white-collar unions are far more serving as making money for their members and managing their pensions and things. And the sense of solidarity does not seem very strong. But the essence of an alliance with the salariat is very strong in areas like recruitment practices, which needs a radical reform, with education. I think the salariat understand that we must decommodify education. You can get an alliance there. With things like rescuing the commons, you can often appeal to the sentimental bourgeois values found with people in the salariat, though the motivation might be different. So I think you can get quite a lot of cross-class alliances in certain areas, but not in every respect. We have to realize that more and more of the salariat are making rental incomes at the expense of the precariat below them. In every occupation, in every sector, you now see the class structure being reproduced. You take the education sector. You have an elite, usually part of the administration, taking phenomenal incomes. You have a salariat, which is getting rental income with long-term tenure, and they're getting higher incomes, and a precariat at the bottom of adjuncts and fractionals and short-term contracts who are being paid well below what used to be the case of a young, rising academic or teacher. So, you know, you cannot say there is a common interest. And I think we would be foolish to pretend that we have a united working class when you have these fragmentations taking place. It's the same in the legal profession, same in the medical professions, same in nursing. You have a tiered structure where there is not a common economic interest. And if we don't understand that, then we won't move to a model which should put as much emphasis on what I call in the books collaborative bargaining, bargaining between different groups in the occupations rather than just with the employer. You need both. You need both. And that I must emphasize. But I'm not hostile to the salariat. I think we can get good alliances, particularly because many people in the salariat, some of you in this room, no doubt, have children. And you know that your sons and daughters have a very low probability of joining the salariat, be in the public sector or in the private sector. But they're likely to go into the precariat. So I think there's scope for that, but it means at least understanding where the contradictions and tensions exist.
Thank you. I see the point of seeing the contradictions, but a critical response to that might be that to say that throughout the history of labor movement, for instance, here in Sweden, the strategy has been to say that the working class, there are a lot of contradictions within the working class, and that the policies that we need to support would be policies that in fact not only build upon the common grounds within the different layers of the working class, but also try to expand them. For instance, through the social security systems that build on replacing a part of your earlier income rather than giving like a flat handouts to someone who becomes sick or becomes unemployed, which is like brings me to your basic income discussion, which at least might at a first glance look as exactly the opposite way of looking at things. That's saying that we need to have a basic income, and above that other processes will need to take on to enable a more equal distribution and so on. My question would be, or my worries are here, are that might be one of the reasons why you would be invited to Davos, because maybe there is I mean, the effects of that from a critical perspective would be the risk of having bigger inequalities in society. You would have maybe slightly better conditions for some of the people who today fall out from the safety nets that have been created in different industrialized societies. But the backside of that would be that you might have a greater inequality. Those in the very top would be happy to give away some more money to have a little bit less of deprivation in society, but they would, but the system as such would actually take steps back from creating more equal qualities of life and more equal conditions in terms of access to education, to healthcare, etc., etc. What would be your comments to that?
Well, my comments, first of all, if anybody's interested, I've just got a new book out which addresses these issues front on, called Basic Income, which has just come out. The labourist solutions enshrined in 1938 agreements and all subsequent models of social democracy in Scandinavia is ultimately drifted towards a form of workfare. It's linked to a labourist model. The famous work line is not a work line, it's a labour line. You want to force many people into jobs, and you emphasize that. Don't think that's a very attractive option for people in the precariat. That's why a lot of Swedes, among many other countries, but I get a lot of emails from Swedes who say that the old social security system that used to exist in Sweden doesn't work these days. A huge number of people have to rely on means-tested social assistance. Now, don't deny it. If huge numbers are relying on means-tested social assistance, you get the same problems as you get anywhere else. You get big poverty trap situations, you get low take-up, you get stigma, you get punitive penalties and all the rest that goes with that model. And more, as we move into a flexible system, which is going to be much greater as platform capitalism grows. You know, within the next 5 years, it's reckoned by McKinsey Global Institute, hardly a radical institution, that 1 in every 3 labor transactions will be done online, without having a direct employer-employee relationship. The old model of tripartism or bipartism and laborism doesn't relate to that world that's coming. And I think the social security system has to be reformed. I don't say a basic income is the only thing or is a panacea, but you must have an anchor that everybody has a guarantee as an economic right of receiving a modest amount that in extremis they could live on. If you don't have that, you don't have a left strategy. I'm sorry. You have an old laborist strategy. But in addition, everybody who has disabilities or special needs with special extra costs should be receiving supplements, but they should be based on those needs, not on means testing or work capability tests or things like that which are spreading around, because those are penalizing and have moral hazards and immoral hazards. So we have to rethink the base of our strategy. But I also believe that a basic income is a matter of social justice. I don't argue it on efficiency grounds. I say that the wealth of all of us, the wealth of every society, is far more to do with the efforts of our ancestors than anything you or I do for ourselves. And in that sense, if you allow for private inheritance, maybe we wouldn't, but if you allow for it, then you should allow for social inheritance so that we each receive a social dividend from the collective wealth. That's the first argument. The same with the environmental justice. We need carbon taxes, but if you impose a carbon tax, it's the poor who pay more. Therefore, have a dividend with it so that you compensate. It's a form of basic income. But the second reason for supporting a basic income is it would enhance freedom. Not only the freedom to say no to an oppressive relationship, a no to an exploitative employer, but also the ability to say yes. The ability to be a citizen. That freedom, that Republican freedom, is vital. And we on the left have allowed the flippin' right to win the argument on freedom over the last 100 years. It's about time we stood up for freedom, very centrally to our agenda. We did a basic income pilot in India, where we provided thousands of people with a basic income and compared what happened to them with what happened to people not receiving a basic income. At the end of 2 years, nutrition had improved, health had improved, schooling had improved, economic activity had increased, but most importantly of all, a sense of emancipation had improved. And the way I like to put it, and I've put it in the book and explained it at much greater length than I'm going to do now, is that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value. Whereas other forms of social security, it's the other way around. That's the sort of thing the left should be thinking. Thank you.
One more set of comments and questions for me before opening up for the rest of the audience. Just one thing that I would like to comment is that I mean, if I look at the sort of concrete political and parliamentary struggles over the different welfare systems here in Sweden the last 10 or 15 years, it's been quite important and quite profound that the right wing has pushed for more of means-tested systems while on the left there has been attempts to try to minimize that and try to re-strengthen some of the other systems that are not basic income, but they are connected to, for instance, if you sick leave, for instance, if you are sick, you're entitled to having an income which is higher than a basic one, or if you're unemployed, you're entitled to having unemployment benefits without having to be overall means tested. So that conflict exists, I think. But what is a bit harder to stomach, I think, is the well, I would say rather negative views that would emerge from your position towards trade unions on the one hand, and also towards the idea of full employment as a sort of an important goal for medium-term economic policies. The reason why I take this up is that because I would say it's hard for me to at least to see a progressive agenda which does not include the trade unions as a not only important but quite pivotal part of demanding better rights for broadly and to strengthening the systems that create more equality rather than more inequality, and also that in absence of policies for full employment, there, at least in Sweden, but I think in most other industrialized countries, the field would be much more open for those who, for different reasons, ideological, pure economical reasons, etc., argue for exactly the kind of degrading and oppressive even systems that demand work for labor, and demand a person who is in need of pecuniary help to also perform a set of tasks that have deep moral implications even. So what would your argument, counter argument would be on that issue regarding the trade unions and full employment policies?
First of all, I've been a trade union member all my life. I strongly support unions. There's no way that we can have a good society unless you have voice, collective and individual voice. At the same time, I'm highly critical of labor unions as they've been in the latter part of the 20th century. To go back to your starting point, you characterized, you said that the right have been pushing for means test and the left have been against it. I can give you statistics that disprove that dramatically. It's the number of people dependent on means-tested benefits have risen in countries, including yours, when there's a social democratic government, as much as a right-wing government. In Britain, the number of people dependent on means testing rose dramatically in the period of New Labour. In the United States, under the Democrats, the leftish party, the number rose dramatically. Every European country, that's the case, regardless of whether a so-called left or a so-called right has been on the thing. I think the unions have to be transformed. As I said in my speech, you know, if I start talking about labor unions to a precariat group, they'll all rush out. And there's a good reason for that. And to give you an example, I was giving a talk to European trade union leaders, including Swedish, to a summer school. And I said, why is it that trade union leaders are the most hostile, have been the most hostile towards basic income? Why is it? Over the years. And at that point, the elderly chair person, not much older than you and me, said, okay, we'll have a coffee break now, before anybody could answer. When we came back from the coffee break, I was still at the podium, and he said, all right, we'll move on to the next subject now. Thank you very much. So I shuffled my papers together and started to move off. But then a trade union leader at the back, he stood up and said, wait. We have to answer Guy's question. And I've been thinking about it because he's right. But why? And I think the reason is that we think that if people had a basic income, they wouldn't join trade unions. And I looked at him, I said, you think about that for 1 second and you will realize that's immoral, right? You don't want people to be secure because they won't join you? You want them to be insecure? And second, it's wrong. Because people join collective bodies and collective action when they have a sufficient amount of security that they're not risking everything. They want to take collective action, but too many people are too scared to raise their heads. The unions have got to rethink. And that leader wrote to me subsequently, he said he's rethought. And the young people who are going into the unions are the ones who are forcing this debate to change. So I hope you do too.
So we're not going to coffee now. We have 15 more minutes. And now, if Denise could help us, we could have a few other questions from the audience over there. And you have to just say your name. Perhaps it would be.
I have a few copies of the books if anyone's interested at the end.
Fiona Winders. I'd like to go on to the question of the different sections of the precariat and their political role, because you talked about the atavists, who are essentially what I might call the reactionaries, or what used to be called in Marxist terms lumpen proletariat, who are looking back, or former working class who are looking back and want to go back to a different time and are easy prey for fascist parties, and how that can rise up to a certain point but not necessarily continue to grow exponentially. And then you talk about nostalgists, and then you talk about progressives. Would you say that, taking the UK as an example, that the atavists, if you like, have reached their peak and gone past their peak? And it's possible, actually, for atavists to go over and be progressives and kind of hop over a stage. Because if you look at the election results in Britain, it appeared that the group that previously voted for UKIP in the UK split. And instead of going to Conservatives, as one might expect that ex-fascists might vote Conservatives, that actually Labour, with a much more progressive agenda, picked up a whole number of voters from what might be called the atavist group on the basis of having progressive socialist policies which appealed to that group and offered them an alternative. So that's my question about, how the shift is happening, and it doesn't necessarily have to be fixed, that there's room for atavists to become progressive and very rapidly.
Thank you. You might comment downstairs.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. I wouldn't call them lumpen in the sense that they do have a continuing role in the production system, but I agree with you in general. I regarded the UKIP phenomenon and Brexit in Britain very much as this atavistic part, linked with the Englanders and the petty bourgeoisie, and going for that sort of strategy. At the beginning of this year, I had the privilege of being asked to become an economic advisor to the Labour leadership, and I thought very deeply about it, because I'm not a member of the Labour Party. And I accepted because I believe that what Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell are doing is reaching out to the precariat. John McDonnell in particular really understands the precariat, and he wants to go much further in articulating it in the next year or so. And we've been working on that. So I'm obviously delighted that we had this big surge of support. And it came, as you correctly say, from part of those people who'd gone for UKIP, shifting back. Some of them didn't vote at all. We must remember that. And some did vote for the Tories. But what happened was that the Labour Party mobilized a lot of young members of the precariat, the educated part of the precariat. Millions of young people suddenly registered to vote and voted. And that's what really happened in May this year in our election. And it's a lesson for you too. It's a lesson for all of us. We have to mobilize the young precariat. And if we can appeal to some of those who are not necessarily racist, but they are people who are angry and they go for, Sweden Democrats or whatever it might be, if we are offering them something that they can say, this is what we need, then we'll get them as well. But the real strategy has to be to mobilize the young precariat.
Thank you.
My name is Josephine, and I'll try to ask this in English. If I switch over somewhere in the middle, Ollie could translate perhaps. I'm not as knowledgeable about any of this as some of you are, and this might seem like a stupid question or something, but you speak of the state as one of the important antagonists to the precariat. How should we, as a party, being part of that state, an important part of it, speak to address the precariat that might look at us as the antagonist? How should we appeal to them, and what? Well, that's my question.
Yep. A very good question. I don't think a left party is really part of the state. I know your point, and it's fair enough. You are an institutional part of it in that sense. I think what we've got to think about is saying, look, the state is not just government, it's the institutions of society which are the system of governance, okay? And if you think from the position of the precariat, then your enemies are the social security services that are oppressing you. They are not necessarily enemies, but these are the type of people you want to reform and the institutions you want to reform. The unions, you want to reform the unions. Don't want to get rid of them, you want to reform the unions. You want to reform the education system. And therefore you're seeing it from the perspective of the precariat and the exploitations and oppressions which various state agencies, deliberately or not, are imposing on you. And that's what I mean. That's why I was saying about the occupations. We need to focus just as much on the bargaining between groups and therefore seeing a reform of the nature of collective bargaining. Not getting rid of collective bargaining, but to see it from the perspective of the precariat. Same with the training system, the same with the commons, access to the commons, reviving the commons, which is where the precariat will put their energy. That's critical. If you have an agenda that says we believe in a charter of the commons to revive the commons, you'll see a lot of people say, hey, I'm going in that direction too. So that's what I mean.
Right, thank you for this very nice presentation. And I have a question similar to the one posed by Ollie, saying that the precariat and the salariat will have opposing class interests. Of course, there's a difference like in how well off they are, but saying that they have opposing class interests would mean that what's good for the salariat is bad for the precariat and vice versa. But I mean, making things worse for the precariat or for the precariat also increase like a pressure on the salariat, because if someone is willing to take my job for like half the salary and half the job security, I mean, I could say I belong to the salariat, but I mean, it's not like it would be good for me to have like increasing pressure and increasing horde of unemployed people willing to take my job for less salary, for example. So could you really say that there's an opposing class interest? Wouldn't you say what's good for the salariat is also good for the precariat, which would mean they belong to the same class, they're just sort of differently well off?
I'll give you an example from Germany. Okay, I could give you an example, but I don't have the figures for Sweden, but I could give for US or a number of other countries, but I'll give it for Germany. Members of the salariat in Germany are today earning about 40% of their total income from capital, from shares, and from stocks and various forms of fixed investments. So that they have an interest in wages falling, because if wages fall, profits rise, and they're getting more of their income from profits. If you tell me they have the same economic interest as the precariat, who gets none of their income from stocks and shares, but only from money wages, not from their pension fund, not from the medical fund, etc., then I'm a duck again. But they don't have the same interests. There is a conflicting interest. The same in university. I've seen it. I've seen it in a number of universities where I've been. The salaried part, the tenured part of academia knows that as more and more precariat they're losing income, more is left for them to be receiving. They're rentiers in the system. So you don't have a common position. And I've known that because I've been out on the barricades supporting the low-income precariat parts in academic institutions. And the tenured salariat have been quietly sitting in their studies. So we do have, it's not to say it's total. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's a difference of orientation. But I think we have to recognize the fragmentation in order to find ways of building up the alliance.
Okay, thank you. So we will have time for one very short last question, and then that would include your final remarks. And before everything ends up here, we once again reiterate that your books are available, and so please.
Okay, Susanna Lundberg, here from Malmö. I'll try to keep this short. I think there's something that sort of scars me in this, and I think that when I heard you talking that the main enemy or the main opponent is not the capital but the state, there is something difficult there, because in a globalized world that the Davos, for example, represents, the state, and particularly the state as a social state and a redistributing state and so on, is under immense pressure, and under immense pressure from the Davos guys and ties. And they don't want our benefit. They don't, they want to listen to you because they want to know how best to, take from us. And and I don't say the state as it is today is perfect in any way. Is undermined, and it has old structures that need to be remodeled and so on. And the labor unions, of course, are part of that as institutions. Maybe particularly in Sweden, I don't know. They have a long history, very tied to the state, with the social democratic governments and so on. But I think that we, as a left movement, need to know that as soon as we see the capitalists as, less opposing than we previously did, then there is something wrong. We need to know that the capital don't want our best interest.
I'm glad you're raising that, because it gives me a chance to clarify, which is this. I said the state is the primary antagonist. Of course, for anybody on the left, capitalism is the enemy, okay? No doubt about it. What I'm saying is that the rentier capitalist system that has been constructed by the state. And we can only reform it by reforming the state. And that means that the supernatural national state and the institutions of WIPO and the international financial agencies. The interesting thing is that there is a division within capitalism, within the producers, or the people who see themselves as the producers of goods and services, and the rentiers. The rentiers are making the big money, the big money, and they've benefited from this global superstructure that I've been analyzing in the corruption of capitalism. And they, the financiers and the rentiers, are our primary target. Other forms of capitalism, of course, are important. I haven't said they're unimportant. But what I'm saying, what I was trying to say was this, that from a member of the precariat, you will entice them to have an opposition progressive politics if you put it in forms of attacking the institutions of the state that are creating their oppression and their insecurity. Their boss may be down the employment exchange 2 weeks after they are in their own mind. Because many of the bosses today are just as insecure. Some aren't, of course. Some aren't. But the primary enemy is not your boss, as it was in the past. The mill owner, the factory owner, the rest of it. Because I may not even know who it is. I may not even care, and he may be changing next week, or actually he's changed before I realized it. I thought it was Jim, it's now James, or Jane, or whatever. So I'm merely saying that this is a strategic issue. Of course, capitalism is the enemy of us, all of us in this room, I trust. But the emphasis on our strategy must be the institutions of the state, much greater than in the past. Let me put it that way. I don't think one is to the exclusion of the other. I think it's a matter of changing the emphasis of our strategy.
So a very big thanks to you for giving us all your knowledge and food for thought for further discussions. Thank you very much for coming here. A big applause.
Sure.
So we exchange them.
Thank you.